Prime Minister, it's important we look at the facts. Why? Why?
Douglas Ross is sounding pretty scared.
Because I believe in independence.
And he clapped like a seal.
Hello and welcome to Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. Joining me this week for a COVID inquiry special are John Ferguson, who's the political editor of the Sunday Mail, and Scottish Daily Express editor Ben Borland. So, as I was saying, it's a UK COVID inquiry special. It's pretty much dominated Scottish politics the last week. It's been based in Edinburgh, taking evidence on the handling of the pandemic north of the border, which, as we know, was led by Nicola Sturgeon. And I think it'd be fair to say that the controversy was triggered by confirmation last week that Nicola Sturgeon has not retained any of her WhatsApp messages, basically blowing a massive hole in our understanding of how she dealt with the pandemic. And that's a pattern that's been repeated throughout her government. The Chief Medical Officer, Gregor Smith, didn't hold on to any of his WhatsApps, nor did Jason Leitch, who was the ubiquitous face of the pandemic and also the National Clinical Director. So, John, let's start with you, because I said pointedly at the beginning that it was confirmed last week that Nicola Sturgeon had not retained any of her messages. You'd actually revealed this in the Sunday Mail at the tail end of last year. So could you just talk us through your original story and what the response was within the SNP and the Scottish Government at the time?
Yeah, so the story that we had at the end of last year was that Nicola Sturgeon and John Swinney and Humza Yousaf had all told the COVID inquiry in response to a formal request that their WhatsApps hadn't been retained. Nicola Sturgeon had told them, the inquiry, that hers had been manually deleted, and the others had said that they hadn't been retained. Now, in the wake of that, Nicola Sturgeon essentially refused to comment many times, as did John Swinney. Interestingly, Humza Yousaf kind of attempted to pour cold water on the story. He said that he didn't know where that story could possibly have come from, and that he had retained his messages and would be handing them, and said they would, or that he'd handed them over. Now, there's big question marks now over exactly when he found this phone that had these messages in. We understand that was actually after the story was published and when he gave that to the COVID inquiry. But in relation to Nicola Sturgeon, you know, there was just a sort of refusal to comment. We've now learned through the inquiry that this story was absolutely true and all our messages had been deleted from her end, at least. We've had a bit of a glimpse into why she wouldn't want those messages to be in the public domain, via some messages which have emerged that she wrote that other people had received. For example, you know, in evidence today, where she's a sort of expletive-ridden message where she's calling Boris Johnson a clown. So the question really is what is in all of these other messages that we'll never see. Reason Nicola, one of the big things that Nicola Sturgeon has, if anything that you could call a legacy, is probably the perception in Scotland that she handled the pandemic very well. You can see how the release of these messages, I mean, what we've seen already is seriously damaging that perception. And I would imagine that if you had the full gambit of messages, it would be damaged far more. So in a sense, you can, if you take a step back from this, you can kind of understand how Nicola Sturgeon feels like it's beyond the score to be asking for every single message she sent within the Freedom of Information Act. There is, like, for example, there's part of that act that allow for, I think it's called frank discussions between ministers not to be released into the public domain. Obviously, during the pandemic, you know, these frank discussions that would have happened within offices just couldn't happen because everybody was at home. And I think everybody across the whole of, in all different industries began to use WhatsApp almost as if they were speaking to the person involved. And you can kind of understand why Nicola Sturgeon feels, come on, this is beyond the score to ask for this stuff. But by the letter of the law, that these communications are FOIable, and there are laws around the retention of information that needs to be passed to an inquiry. And it's clear that Nicola Sturgeon understood from a very early stage that there was going to be an inquiry and that these messages should be retained. So there's huge question marks, and I guess when the real issue here is potentially information has been destroyed that could be politically embarrassing for Nicola Sturgeon, but that could have been extremely illuminating and helpful for future governments who may have to deal with another pandemic.
Ben, let's face it, it looks bloody awful. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It just, the optics of having no WhatsApp messages to provide to an official public inquiry looks dreadful. I mean, how serious a blow do you think it is to gaining this full understanding of how Nicola Sturgeon dealt with the pandemic, and how serious do you think it is to her reputation?
So to answer both parts of that question, how serious a blow is it to the chances of us getting a good understanding? I have to say, thanks to the UK COVID Inquiry Council and the chair, Baroness Hallett, I think we've had two of the most interesting and informative weeks that I can remember for years. Finally, the veil of secrecy that the Scottish government's managed to throw over most of its dealings and actions has been lifted. And even though Nicola Sturgeon has deleted all her messages, even though John Swinney had his phone set to auto-delete, even though Jason Leitch made this quip about deletion being a pre-bed ritual, despite all of this, I think we were still getting enough information and enough evidence out there to finally kind of sweep away this idea that John said, and I think you're quite correct in saying so, that there's this perception that the Scottish government did really well during COVID, when I think there's a small but kind of vocal minority, and I'd include myself among them, who think actually the Scottish government did far worse during COVID, and Scotland suffered as a result of that. And I think by the day now, people are starting to join that view. And so this brings us on to the second part of the question: how serious is it to her reputation? I mean, her reputation is already plummeted in the past 18 months. I think this is just yet another absolutely huge blow to this persona of this great stateswoman. We can see now that it just wasn't the case. It really wasn't the case. I think WhatsApp deletion aside, Professor Mark Woolhouse yesterday delivered some of the most damning evidence, a real wrecking ball to this idea that the Scottish government's ultra cautious approach did any good. I mean, he was very clear that schools didn't need to be closed, but they went ahead and closed them anyway. He was very clear that masks, I mean, Jason Leitch himself essentially says, sorry, I'll just stop that. Essentially said that masks didn't work because, he gave Humza Yousaf a workaround and said, as long as you've got a drink in your hands at all times, then you don't need to wear your mask. If they were so effective, would he have really have said that? And then I think most of all in Professor Woolhouse's evidence was this this section on hospital admissions. And we knew this. We knew that people were staying away from the NHS as a result of this kind of ultra zealous stay at home. You must stay at home approach. and people have died as a result. Thousands of people have developed diseases that would have been picked up at an earlier stage. Thousands of people have gone untreated, and many of them have died as a result. I mean, it really was devastating. And I know the focus is on the WhatsApps, but the whole remit of the inquiry is to examine whether what our governments did was the correct response. And aside from the fact that this is all being kept secret and the kind of mocking and sneering approach that those in power had towards the rest of us, it's also been proved that, it didn't work. I mean,
Ben, do you think that the WhatsApp scandal, is this the Scottish Government's Partygate, you think?
I think it is. I wrote a piece to that effect for the Scottish Daily Express website this week. And I have seen other commentators. I didn't copy it, but I did see Brian Wilson in The Scotsman had made the same point, and quite a few people have said the same. I think it is the Scottish Government's Partygate. I think the shame is that we're now 2 years further down the line. COVID, thankfully, and the lockdowns and everything that we went through is quite a long way in the rearview mirror now. Whereas when Partygate broke in December 2021, it was still a very real and very sort of tangible threat. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to diminish COVID. It was a terrible pandemic, and lots of people suffered greatly. It was a horrible disease. I have friends and family members who suffered a great deal. The point is that the experts are saying perhaps we didn't need to go that far, and it was known at the time we didn't need to go as far as we did. The comparison with Partygate, I think, is valid, because Partygate seemed like a slap in the face. We'd all stuck to the rules, and yet here was Boris Johnson and others in the UK government just ignoring their own rules. It now seems clear that the rules were also being ignored, maybe not on such a grand scale, but also this kind of laughing behind the when the cameras were switched off, Allegra Stratton and the others were joking about a party in Downing Street. That probably set the ball rolling on the tone that made people think the UK government, Boris, they're laughing behind the backs at us for being so stupid that we would follow the rules for all that time. It's now clear that while there's no evidence that ministers were doing this, or not yet anyway, that officials were also laughing and sneering and joking about the rules that we were religiously following.
John, just two aspects of the secrecy angle. A couple of revelations that have come out. Nicola Sturgeon gave a SNP email address to Professor Devi Sridhar, who's an expert or sort of very vocal figure during the pandemic. And also this morning, it's come out that Nicola Sturgeon was using a personal phone for government business. What do you make of these two things in relation to the WhatsApp row and just this perception of secrecy?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think with all these things, everybody knows that all of governments, Westminster, Holyrood, they were both completely unprepared for the pandemic, and it's natural that loads of mistakes would have been made. But what kind of seems worse is this attempt to cover up mistakes. And I think it's very interesting, for example, those communications with Devi Sridhar, where it would appear, and I mean, it was even more explicit in some of the evidence from Jason Leitch, that this wasn't just like sort of something at the time that they were deleting WhatsApps or using party emails or personal phones just, by chance. That was something to do. It does appear that there was always a concerted effort to avoid putting communications on record that they knew at some later date could potentially find their way into the public domain, and that's really pretty unacceptable. You don't need to go back very far before government. In government, absolutely everything down to the last phone call was, recorded by someone who would be listening in every single communication that a government minister made, and rightly so, because the decisions that they're making are hugely important, and there can be big lessons to learn for the future. I mean, for example, the communication with Devi Sridhar, I 100% agree with some of the points Ben was making there, that really what this inquiry is about is trying to get to the bottom of, did we make the right decisions? Did the lockdowns, for example, cause more non-COVID deaths than COVID deaths? And I mean, we haven't even get into the decision-making behind the sending people with COVID into care homes. And to understand all that stuff, what you need to know is who was the First Minister really listening to. And so, for example, I think it's fairly well known that Devi Sridhar was, rightly or wrongly, fairly strong on lockdowns and testing, and the idea that you could control the virus and, through controlling society. So it's really important to understand who is the First Minister listening to, and what were those people that she was listening to telling her. If you don't know that, then really important stuff will just never be known.
John, you mentioned Jason Leitch there. As I said at the beginning of the show, he's the National Clinical Director. To give him a bit of credit, he is a very effective communicator. I don't think it's any secret that he was put on off the ball pretty much every week during the pandemic. But there was that WhatsApp that was released, or that message, in which he said that deleting messages was a pre-bed ritual. He then tried to laugh it off during his own evidence by saying he was being flippant. Do you think that the Jason Leitch share price has fallen a bit over the last couple of days?
Yeah, I think it has. It's in Jason Leitch's role in the pandemic was quite interesting. While his sort of opposite numbers in Westminster appeared to do more or less, it was a much more limit. They appeared to be, Chris Whitty and the likes were genuine technical advisors, and the presentation was done by ministers in Scotland. Jason Leitch really kind of took on the role as the sort of the spokesman for the pandemic. It was all about presentation and messaging to the public, and he was very good at it in many respects. He did. I think it was, it was noticed by everybody. He seemed to be enjoying that a great deal, and quite enjoying the fame that he found through this. That's not to say that he did. He obviously understood how terrible the pandemic was, and was trying to do a public service. But his profile rocketed at the time, and it really has fallen in some of the messages that have come out. I think, most importantly, the one where he appears to be giving Humza Yousaf this workaround for avoiding mask wearing, that, especially given that he is the guy who should have been giving the advice on why this was critically important to wear masks. It seems odd that he would then be advising a government minister that he didn't really need to follow the rules as long as he kept a drink in his hand.
I know. Ben, this shit show leads perfectly to Humza Yousaf giving evidence to the UK Government inquiry at 2 o'clock.
Yes.
In about half an hour. So he has to deal with all this stuff about deleted WhatsApps, the behaviour of his predecessor, Jason Leitch. It's not going to be a comfortable afternoon for him, is it?
No, it's not. I think if truth were told, I think we'll learn that Humza Yousaf was actually, even though he was the health secretary for the kind of second half of the 2 years that the pandemic is sort of seen as covering, actually he was quite a small player in Nicola Sturgeon's government. It was telling in Jason Leitch's evidence that even Kate Forbes, who was then the finance secretary and presumably kind of one of the senior cabinet secretaries, wasn't really in the loop. And Liz Lloyd, who was giving evidence this morning, together with Nicola Sturgeon, were really in charge of the daily COVID briefings. So if Humza's honest, he's going to say, look, no one ever really spoke to me or asked my opinion about anything. But then I think that's going to show in a quite a bad light.
Yeah, I think you're right, because at the top end you've got Sturgeon, Liz Lloyd, and then you've got probably Jean Freeman, the former Health Secretary, Jason Leitch, and then I think a couple of rungs below that.
John Swinney as well, I think was
John Swinney, and then so a couple of rungs below you probably got Humza, who came in as Health Secretary at the tail end when
it was his job was NHS recovery, which has obviously not exactly gone very well.
Yeah, but just a broader political point, Ben. Humza took over as FM last year. Now, every political leader wants to get a bit of momentum, get a bit of wind behind them in the early days, but he just hasn't, because he's still in the shadow of Nicola Sturgeon, his predecessor. So the early days were overshadowed by Operation Branchform. He also inherited a bunch of duff policies that he ditched. Now he's in the middle of this nightmare about deleted WhatsApps. He just can't seem to strike out on his own, can he?
No, he can't. I think that's because, he campaigned as the continuity candidate. He campaigned as the guy who didn't really seem to have a new direction to take the party or the government in. So no, he's really struggling to get going, and this will just happen time and time again. I think he's just going to be forever haunted by the mistakes of his predecessor, who was such a big figure in Scottish life for so long and in Scottish politics, that as her reputation kind of slowly, in this sort of slow motion car crash, unravels, it all just falls back on him. He can't make a fresh start. I have to say, just to sort of, I'm looking forward to Humza Yousaf's evidence. I have to say, I wish the UK inquiry was spending more than 3 weeks in Scotland. I feel like we're getting more answers in this very short space of time than we've had from multiple inquiries, and certainly the Scottish COVID inquiry. You now sort of think, well, what's the point, other than, is that now going to be an exercise in sort of undoing some of this damage? I feel like this is a real lesson in how a public inquiry should be run. And you look at some of the public inquiries we've had under the current administration, I think they go on for a very long time, and they tend not to ask the difficult questions. Whereas in the space of, we're only into the second week of this 3-week spell in Edinburgh, and it's been, fascinating and appalling in equal measure. And just to pick up on something that, in a previous hearing, when the inquiry was in London, Boris Johnson has given evidence. I'm sure he will again. Nicola Sturgeon, we know, was very disparaging about him this morning. But I thought he said something in one of his sessions that was really interesting, that he regretted the early decision in March 2020 to treat COVID as a health issue rather than under civil contingencies legislation, because that would have allowed the UK government to say, look, the devolved administrations aren't getting a say in this. We're running this as a civil, in the same way you might run the response to a disaster or, some terrible natural disaster. The UK government steps in and overrides all the devolved administrations. Instead, it was treated as a health emergency, and therefore the devolved administrations all got to put their own rules in place. Maybe people will disagree with me and be throwing things at the screen, but I think if COVID had been run by the UK government, people in Scotland, people in Wales, people in Northern Ireland, people across the UK would have actually come out of it rather better. And we wouldn't have had the distractions of cross-border rows about things.
The UK government made a complete arse of it.
Well, so did the Scottish government. But at least you've only got one government.
How would it have been better if the UK government had done it for all of us?
Well, because we wouldn't have had the constant cross-border sniping and, you know, these ugly scenes at the border when people were told don't come to Scotland, we would have just had one government making a mess instead of two.
More Boris Johnson. Not sure I agree with that. I mean, I think both governments.
I'm sure some people, you know, like I say, will be outraged at such a thing. But I personally think having the UK government in charge throughout. I mean, perhaps it could have been Alistair Jack could have put in some rules for Scotland. I think we might have seen some more sensible policies.
I'll agree to disagree on that one, Ben. John, just to go back to a point Ben made about Humza and the sort of legacy. Do you think part of his problem is not so much the Operation Branch Form and the WhatsApps, but it's the fact that he is stuck so closely to Nicola Sturgeon? You know, he ran as the continuity candidate, so you know he can't step out of her shadow. He's kind of joined at the hip with her. He's made his decision, and he always has to answer for her mistakes, rather than simply saying, "I don't agree with what she did there. I wish she hadn't done it."
Well, I mean, in a way, yes. So he stood as the continuity candidate. He's clearly feels indebted to Nicola Sturgeon for helping him get the job. But you do think that he has had many opportunities to make a clean break without having to be particularly nasty about Nicola Sturgeon. Just make a clean break and stamp his own character on the government. But it does seem like he's, you know, a lot of Humza's problems you could blame on his predecessor, but then he seems to be at every turn making the wrong decision on other things. I mean, a recent example is sort of the failure to just immediately ban XL bullies is clearly a silly decision, and it's now blowing up in his face. You get the feeling that they're walking into another potential disaster with the conversion therapy bill. There's, you know, there are other things that he could be concentrating on, but instead he seems determined often to, you know, to keep concentrating on the same policies that Nicola Sturgeon would be, and kind of just making mistakes that he doesn't need to. He'd mentioned earlier what he might learn this afternoon, or the potential pitfalls for Humza at the COVID inquiry. I think a really interesting thing will be whether he has to answer questions on whether he did, as the Sunday Mail story said, initially tell the inquiry that his WhatsApps hadn't been retained. I strongly believe that to be the case. If you remember, the chronology of it was that he said, "I've got no idea where that press report came from. I've retained all my WhatsApps and handed them over." Now, I suspect that he had handed them over possibly that morning, or, you know, sometime very closely following our story being published. If it emerges that he has told the inquiry that his WhatsApps hadn't been retained, so it clearly was misleading the public and saying that he didn't know where that press report had come from. And also, if it emerges that he potentially hasn't given all of his WhatsApps to the inquiry, then again, you know, I think he'll have huge questions to answer. So he's really struggled to get out of Nicola Sturgeon's shadow, but it kind of feels like he doesn't want to get out of her shadow, and it's sort of difficult to work out why that is. You know, another example would be the Michael Matheson iPad bill affair. You know, it just seemed like there was an easy way to deal with that and a right way to deal with that, and he didn't do it. So I think from what I gather, he's in many of these issues, he's been given advice by some of his senior advisors to take a different course, but he's deciding on his own that he doesn't want to. So it's yes, some of his decisions are really inexplicable, to be honest.
Just to wrap this section up, Nicola Sturgeon is giving her own evidence on Wednesday. I think that's a full day. That's going to be the key moment of the UK COVID inquiry from a Scottish perspective, no doubt. And I think that we'll be looking at that in great depth on Thursday and the next Planet Holyrood. So let's turn to good week, bad week. Ben, start with you.
I was just going to point out to John there, it would be a great surprise if an SNP figure had given a false statement to the Sunday Mail. Surely that's never happened before. Good week. I mean, again, it's all on the inquiry. Jamie Dawson, KC, the lead counsel to the UK COVID-19 inquiry, I think has been an absolute revelation and shows what a forensic legal mind can do when it's put to work dismantling politicians. I think some of our MSPs are really good and they do a great job, but they're not always allowed to really get into the weeds and question people. I think he's been, you know, he's a new Express hero, shall we say. I
think he's been brilliant. He's
been very good, hasn't he?
Not in a sort of showboaty, grandstanding way, just that sort of quiet, methodical style he's got.
I think, you know, it shouldn't do, but it does help that he's also a Scot. And I think if he was a very smart English KC, it might rub some people up the wrong way and say, oh, you know, what's it? So it immediately neutralizes any kind of complaint that people might have that, oh, hang on, this is someone just picking on the Scottish government. There's that. Bad week, staying with the COVID inquiry, and I think she'll be glad that's over. Liz Lloyd, I think most of us in newspapers will know Liz from down the years. But I mean, from when I knew her many years ago, she seems to have been promoted into a position of great power as basically Nicola Sturgeon's number 2, and clearly at a level above cabinet secretaries when it came to decision making on some aspects of the pandemic. So I don't take any pleasure in it, but I think she's clearly come a cropper this week.
John, over to you.
So I'll step a little bit away from the pandemic. I would say that Alistair Jacks, the Scottish Secretary, had appears to be having a good week in that he's just announced that he's going to pursue the Scottish Government for costs over the failed court attempt to get the GRR legislation through. But I would temper that by saying I just wonder whether this stuff might backfire a bit. It seems pretty clear to me now that the UK government and Alistair Jack feel like the Scottish government are weak and that Humza Yousaf is someone that can be bullied and pushed around. And I just wonder whether these constant attacks might begin to rub the public up the wrong way. You know, like there doesn't really seem to be any good. It doesn't really seem that it's going to help Scotland in any way for Alistair Jack to sort of sue the Scottish government or pursue the Scottish government through the courts for a couple of $100,000 to pay for what is, you know, as misguided as it was, basically a sort of attempt to protect, or what they saw as a attempt to protect devolution. So I wonder how long he can keep doing it. He's obviously getting a great reputation within the UK government as the guy that's battering a punch-drunk SNP around the ring, but I just wonder if that'll how people really feel about that.
I think it's over people's heads. I think it's a detail that
yeah.
I'm not, you know, I think they probably follow the gender spat a little bit, but in terms of who pays the costs,
ultimately the taxpayer pays the costs.
Yeah, exactly. We're paying it either way.
Comes out of.
Yeah, that's true. How about bad week, John? Who have you got?
Bad week, I'd say Jason Leitch, like you mentioned earlier. He was the sort of one of the heroes of the pandemic, off the ball every week, and he's had a bit of a shocker this week. In danger of being shown a red card after it emerged that he gave Humza a bit of advice on how to get around the rules that he was supposed to be coming up with and getting all the rest of us to follow. So I think it's, and also, you know, the messages where it's quite clear that they're aware of FOI legislation and all the rest of it, and they're making a concerted effort to try to get round it and make sure that their communications aren't recoverable in the future. So I think he's a bit of a stinker.
Something tells me he won't be on Tam Cowan's show this Saturday.
Sick as a parrot.
Yes, indeed. Okay, chaps, thanks for that. Thank you again. I hope that listeners enjoyed this COVID special. And as I said earlier, next week will be about Nicola Sturgeon's evidence to the same inquiry, which I'm pretty sure will be quite an experience. So I hope to see you again next week.
I think it's important we look at the facts. Why? Why?
Douglas Ross is sounding pretty scared.
I believe in independence. And he clapped like a seal.